Hey there, welcome back to Tap. Doing a freestyle intro here is Manna. I'm already tired of my normal one, so we'll just flow with it. In this podcast, I speak a lot about trauma, the after effects of trauma as it relates to one's sense of identity, personal agency, and connection to other people. I just want to say, don't be discouraged about this whole talk about trauma. We're not defined by our wounds, but we need to be able to look at it in order to realize where the shame and self-doubt comes from. It comes from the filter of someone who had to adapt to violations of connections. Now we got choices, especially when we do the work and realize old strategies and therefore not to let those strategies and perceptions limit what kind of person you are. Okay, let's get to it. There is so much I want to say, and if you don't know it, how should you know it? But maybe you can hear it. How I make these episodes is with a lot of unstructured, unruly notes that are just piled up, and I have to, now that I've decided now I'm going to record, I have to make some sense of what it is that I was thinking while I was writing the notes, and the spaces between the notes, I'm making it up as we go. I'm speaking from my heart, not making it up. I'm speaking from my heart to you, but that's why sometimes there's a lot of circular motions, and I do appreciate that. I appreciate that we don't exhaust one topic and then completely leave it, because it is much more complicated than that to me. So, and in that spirit, let's take a little recap of the theme from the last episode. The theme was dissociation, and it's always in this podcast, I think. It's through the lens of a trauma survivor. So in this case, the disconnection is between the mind and the body, and it's a strategy, or it's a protective mechanism, which anything can be used as a protective mechanism, really, in order to survive. So it's a state where you withdraw emotionally. You can even imagine that you put a wall up between you and everyone else, which means you not only miss your own emotional signals, but also the signals of others. So it's really it's a fear response, and it walls you off from being curious and open. So withdrawing emotionally, numbing out, shutting down is what we talked about. And we also said that dissociation is on a scale, it's on a spectrum. So, and what we care for is not when it, just happens and it really doesn't matter that maybe you just have this out-of-body experience, but it doesn't really matter to you. What we care about is when this disembodiment blocks you in some way, when it gets in the way of you living your life. And that's really when we need to find safety for ourselves in our bodies and in the moment, in the present moment, and inviting myself back to me. So that was partly my intent with the meditation that you might have discovered on here, to go from this disembodied state to a more reassociated state, to reconnect with your physical self and the feelings that's there for you. So let me know what you thought about that meditation, or if you're gonna do it later. I'd love to hear from you, because leaving this dissociative state is really what we need to do in order to know what our needs are, and to bring awareness to the body, becoming very physical sensations. It's going to enable us to regulate and handle emotions so that we can react to the outside world in a good way, so we are able to tolerate more emotions, tolerate more of what is already there in us that we may be walled off from when dissociated. So being in a therapist seat, it is so interesting. It is so interesting how important it is for this practice of coming back to myself and the reason why I have to come back is because I tend to, be so swallowed up in the process and what the client is sharing about himself. I'm like, oh, all over in that. And then, returning to myself, returning to my body, sitting here, feeling the bodily physical sensations, because being embodied reduces the risk of countertransference. The risk of countertransference is, when it clouds my capacity to be open and curious if my biases is too mixed with what I'm hearing. So being embodied, being really secure and safe in your therapist's seat means that we monitor ourselves, we track what is going on inside, being in the body, connecting again to that state of being mindfully aware of what's going on, so that our own perspective don't creep in situations where we actually want to explore something from a much more neutral place. So in the last episode, we talked about dissociation from different sides of that problem. And I mean, there are so many ways to talk about it, right? Because if you know IFS, they talk about parts of the selves that have been left out of consciousness. We talk about that as well, but in IFS language, they are called, I believe, exiles. And so that's really interesting to think of it as something that has been expelled. You are not allowed to be here, and then that becomes only a part of you then, who's now home and who's able to interact with other people, and other parts of you are just expelled. So we can talk about numbing in terms of addictive behavior, and I mentioned again that it's on a scale, it's a matter of degree of dissociation. And so you have the dissociation, and then I believe there are under categories of disorders like depersonalization and derealization. And it's all concrete human experiences, even though it's found in DSM-5. It is a sickness, I'm not denying that, but it's also just sometimes not. It's also concrete human experiences that may not relate to any pathology. But so I want to read something to you that I found in a book called Unreal, and normally I'll always tell you the page number, but I can't find it because it's an ebook. But just Google feeling unreal, depersonalization disorder, something. You'll find it if you just Google feeling unreal. Cattell explains that the true self is the unembodied self that functions as observer, controller, and critic of what the body is experiencing and doing. The true self translates into action and what one wants to be. Only the true self feels real. The false self, in contrast, is built on compliance. The false self arises in compliance with the intentions or expectations of significant others and what one imagines these to be. The body is perceived more as an object among other objects in the world than as the core of one's individual being. The individual feels that he or she is a spectator of what the body is doing rather than a participant observer. Cattell summarized that vulnerability to depersonalization comes about through deficiencies and distortions of the patient's experiences with nurturance in infancy and in subsequent stages of personality development. These include, listen up, this is really important, okay. These include exposure to double-bind messages, rejection of the true self, and fostering of the development of the false self. In essence, the infant is programmed to deny satisfaction of his needs and expression of his emotions in order to avoid extreme anxiety. So as we progress into talking about religious trauma, that is something where there are double-bind messages. Okay, but we're still in the recap, and we're talking about what we could also call a loss of self. And a really culturally accepted, I'd say, example of this is when you lose your job, let's say. And I think stereotypically it would be a man losing his job, but I think let's just open that up. So you lose your job, and then you feel alienated, and like maybe what would seem like a complete overreaction. But the thing is that the sense of self, had been rooted in a shallow ground to begin with, rooted in the role that you play at the job. So when you lose the job, you lose yourself. And then I don't know, when I say it's culturally accepted, I think it's because we have heard about that many times, but then what? Do we ask deeper questions? Because I really want to talk about it in the context of early childhood, where as an infant, our perceptions of self can be distorted due to traumatic experiences, due to whatever the mother carries from trauma, birth trauma, all of this. But then it might just become also a habit and a learned response. And that can be changed because, of course, as an adult, when you lose your job, you're not dependent on that job. You're not dependent on that role. But that was just so ingrained in you that it's just so much easier to navigate the world through a concrete role. And I think, it's a survival response. It's an identity that has formed, that has made you feel like now you've lost yourself. And so there's so much therapy to have had to go to on that. But then there's also this thing of just shifting some habits. Okay, I used to have this as my identity, and now let's shake that up anyway. But you could do that through therapy, of course. Okay, this is where I really try to link the notes I have here, freestyling. Not sure if it makes sense completely, but I'll move forward, and I'm sure that there's gonna come some sense here. So again, the help when the personality is disconnected from the present life is learning to stay with internal sensations of the body. For me, bringing attention down into the stomach, into the deep belly, in the lower belly, noticing, relaxing. That's a big one for the emotional relationship with my belly as well, which often hangs out more than what people think it should. So the attention resting and relaxing into myself, even into places in my body that are harder to accept due to social whatever norms, that's incremental, I think, to change. So just a quick mention about the astrology that we touched base with last time, Uranus and Neptune. It's the archetypes of Aquarius and Pisces, and I think last time I said something like it's the same, like houses, planets, it's signs. That's just aspects. It's all the same, and I don't mean it's the same, but I mean it's the same archetype. That's what I mean. That's a difference, because of course it's not entirely the same. It's different. It's different symbols, but same archetype. Okay, so Uranus and Neptune is quite interesting. So Uranus, that's the one that's connected to Aquarius and the 11th house. And this dissociative state, but let me just tell you the function of Uranus. The function of Uranus is clarity. Because of this higher vantage point that Uranus has, it's mental, complex, future-oriented, and will try and control things through knowledge, through the higher self, the self that's online, awake. Whereas Neptune represents the stripping down to the basics and adhering to a bigger picture, to why we're here in the first place, but it's not attached to having things go the way that you planned. We don't know the future. It's a mystery. It's related to dreams, surrender, to have no self. And when you're in an altered state of awareness, awakening, then there's that feeling of no self, that maybe you're one with everything. So that's Neptune. So Uranus can detach from the body. In that Uranus, that archetype, you'll use thinking and intelligence to keep emotions at a distance. Uranus is the full mind, full of solutions, full of research. And Neptune can dissociate through not at all embody maybe not ever embody, maybe you're not truly incarnate. I mean, you're here, but not your soul has not come into the body. And instead, a Neptunian thing is choosing to live in the etherical room, where the mind is blank, numb, spaced out. You don't know. There's an emptiness to it. So as a Pisces, I'm very Neptunian and relate to this otherworldly etherical realm. And throughout my life, it has definitely been a big part of my self-concept. And I have taken pride, as we're going to talk about this in relation to religion as well, but I've taken definitely pride in that it's better to live in the spiritual, higher ideals. But you know what? I have several memories of me going to the doctor, saying that my back hurt. And he would say, "Where does it hurt? Can you point it out?" And I would say, "I don't know. I don't know where it is. It just hurts." And he would say, "Then I can't really help you. I don't know where it is. I mean, you can eat some pills, but we can't really, I don't know what's going on if you can't locate it." And I just remember that when I was reading about detachment, I was like, maybe that's a big, those memories of going to the doctors. And I'm like, because I remember doing it several times, and I remember like, next time I'm just going to say that it's in the lower back. I'm going to say it's there so he can give me some help. But when I was there, I could never really answer, because he would, then if I said it's in the lower back, he would pressure or something, and I wouldn't react to it, which is really not a sign of there's any pain, right? That's just a funny memory, that I couldn't place where the pain was. It just hurts. I don't know where it is. Isn't it interesting? I don't know. Let me hear from you if you're familiar with this sort of thing. Anyway, we also spoke of the moon, which is the filter of all life expressions. It's what we individually retain from all that's going on in life. So it's about what we emotionally are bound to and what we perceive due to our unique attachment. So it's a place in the birth chart we go to see what is it that this person has internalized from all that there is in life, what's personal to this person. So we spoke of moon in relationship to Uranus, and Uranus can be erratic, but it could also be moon Saturn. I found a piece written by Liz Green, who's a great astrologer, and so I'm just going to quote her. She says, "Moon Saturn can be extremely defensive. The defenses against vulnerability in extreme cases can lead to total dissociation from feelings." Yeah, I also have that conjunction, by the way, Moon Saturn, which I told you I had Moon Uranus. Well, my moon is surrounded by quite a few players, which talks about my family history, attachment style, and then the moon is also our key to happiness. We should definitely do a whole chapter on the moon one time, but not now. I have so much I want to talk to you about. Can you hear that? But let's now go to the topic that you may even be here for, I don't know, but religious trauma. And it is unfortunately a very smooth transition from dissociation to religious trauma, because you have to dissociate in order to be in a religion, I'd say. If you trust your body, it's hell. You can't. It's like a central message in Christianity is that the body is sinful. So if I was to trust myself, I would die. But not only that, because death is death is something that I don't want to talk about every Christian because it's different, I know, but some of us actually looked forward to death, right? So, I mean, pain, just eternal pain in hell is what would happen if you were to trust yourself. It was completely unconscious, as it also is with dissociation. I shut down my authenticity, and it was not until the age of 30, my Saturn return, where I connected to some spiritual values that actually aligned with the true self, to use that term. But even trusting that took a long time, and it's not something, that's easily recovered from. And I definitely also should do a whole chapter on Saturn return so that we have a common agreement on what that is. Not today. A thing that I often hear, even really smart people say, smart people who's not been in a religion like I have, is that why they would maybe they ask it, maybe they just have this assumption that you just believe this because someone tells you that it's right. You just believe it because everyone else in the church believe it. Sure. I mean, I don't want to go too much into that one, because you can say, isn't there a lot of things in this world that we believe in, despite the fact that we don't actually 100% understand it? So that's one thing. But I'm missing an important point here, which is that I believed I was nothing. I was nothing without this faith. Okay, so what I'm talking about is not just being part of something, doing just compliance, doing what everyone else is doing, never thinking for yourself. My own thinking was Christian by its nature. So I had been so manipulated into thinking in terms of this that I could not think outside of it. So I feel it's a little bit misunderstood to just say, oh, you're just trusting this because other people tell you to. No, I actually experienced that that was my whole life. And now let's go back, because maybe you haven't heard chapter 0, and I wouldn't really wish it for a lot of people. It's a bit grum. But I was born into an extremist fundamentalist environment. And trust me, for me, that used to be very positive words. I would, as a young adult, I would say, I'm a fundamentalist. I'm an extremist. I would say that, because for me, it just meant, you go all in, and that's absolutely the ideal. So I was active for around 28 years in the faith, in the church. I've left twice, okay? And I left the first time when I was around 24. And then I rejoined the church when I was around 27. And then around the Saturn cycle, in a couple of years after, then I left again. And all through having left, and also when I came back, I was in such a self-shaming process where I had just no trust in myself. I mean, when I was out of the faith, I felt so estranged from the world, being like, an ex-Christian. No one really understood what that was. Not really a worldly person, not really understanding the secular world. And then in my case, I was, young and had 3 kids that I was absolutely, completely immature to be raising on my own. And I had left my worldview, my network, everything. I've had such a hard time really explaining what this loss was about, because it was a loss, and then yet it was also, okay, I can't sit here and cry about it. Like I have diapers to do, I have things to do, and then, as I shared in chapter 0, I did give a child up for adoption, and I felt so estranged from the world, and I had sex with different men, hoping that it might help me in some way. It did not. I'll tell you that. But that was also, I would also shame myself for that, of course, just automatic feelings of, because that's not allowed in the religion. So when I was out and I did it, these automatic feelings of guilt would come. And what I want to underscore here is how I told myself, never trust in yourself again, is what I said, because then, I may come into a religion again if I trust myself. So I didn't realize at that time, I'm still like answering the person who would say, you just believe this because everyone tells you should believe it. This is sort of still an answer to that. I did not realize that the religion was built on not trusting myself and my intuition, because I had so deeply felt that this was my truth. Even though I did, in fact, suppress who I was, what I felt, what I was feeling in my gut. And not only did I just follow the Bible and, the truth that had been laid into me, I had no idea that someone could have a true self and that you can use that true self to shape your life from. So going back into religion after having left, there of course was massive shame and guilt, and then that is such that really propelled me to ask for forgiveness, right? And what does it mean to ask for forgiveness? Of course, you do it in a prayer and you cry and all of that, but then also it means a lot of volunteer work. It also means you're just gonna do anything because now he's forgiven you and you're so happy, you're so grateful, you're just gonna do anything for this God, So I recommitted to only trusting God, to stay on that theme, to only trusting God again, because when I looked at what happened when I trusted me, I stepped out of the fold, stepped out of the faith. So it took such a long time until I realized that the issue was what I was taught, what was taught to me about my own nature, rather than the problem being that I had trusted myself, which is actually a very important thing to do. Okay, so I'm just gonna give you some core messages that are in this religion. And I have these formulations from Marlene's book, on Leaving the Fold. I'm sure you can find that because that's like the classic on religious trauma. And then Googling online and then just adding what I think that I have been through. So it's a mix of that, what I'm going to mention. And there's, of course, a lot more, but this is just to give you an idea about, the core messages that you will receive in the religion. There is only one truth, and there's only one road to that truth, and it's a narrow road. And when you're in this religion, you're used to dealing with existential ultimate answers, not questions. You value the non-material, humility, and unconditional love, which are great values, just maybe not on earth here, especially when you're a very young child. You feel God is watching you all the time, and it really can bring a sort of paranoia. There's lots of right, wrong, good, bad, sin, and perhaps some gray area. There's feelings of anxiety, a compulsive need to confess every bad thing that you've done. That's my own. But I think it applies for more. Nightmares and catastrophic thinking about hell and fears of falling out of the faith. Fighting any kind of selfishness or anything that's self-serving. And then very low ambitions. This is mine too. Okay, I shouldn't keep saying what's mine and what's not mine. It's all mine. I've taken these notes because I relate to all of them. Okay? So I'm gonna stop adding that. Okay, sorry. Very low ambitions in terms of education and job, especially for women, unless the ambition involves spreading the word of God, which would be the ultimate just next to being a wife and a mother. Isolation from the worldly knowledge, no sexual or violent content growing up, which as kids we noticed, but what we didn't notice and we couldn't know was the books and the information missing because we didn't realize it was even there to be censored in the first place. And the reason is it is not about thinking for yourself, but to follow the truth. And some books can make you lose your faith, which would be the worst. So sublime trust in God, because the answer to a normal protest is, why did you do this to me? God is that God has a plan and nothing is a mistake. You're trained in judging and even condemning others. You have to suppress joy, and it does get complicated because it depends on the kind of church you're in. So I'll leave that maybe a bit open, and it's fine if we should take that out. But it's actually a topic to be explored on a deeper level. Because even though that some churches dances around are really happy, I still believe that there's some suppression of, if not joy, then pleasure. Okay, feeling like you're an object to be saved. They don't love you for you, but you're part of the church and you need to be saved. And that is, of course, reciprocated so that you continue to do that to non-believers. And then I have written, women are not allowed, and then it says nothing. I think just add in words. Women are not allowed to a lot of things, like at least not to become ministers and to have leadership roles, but again, a bit depending on church. But again, I think it's there just between the lines, maybe more explicit in other churches. Okay, feelings are not understood, it's not spoken about, but of course we are manipulated through the feelings. So some churches are really emotionally aware, but it's not like the single church participants' emotions are important. Having an idea about being filled with demons and needing exorcism. Being afraid of the flesh. There is conveyed double messages to you. So that's the norm. And then I've just written like that I could not imagine my life without this faith in Christ and without the community. And that's again just to underscore how attached I was. And when I've done some research on this, I also come to the studies of attachment theory, where you can say, it's the same if it's a religious figure that you are attaching to, as well as a parental figure. So it's very, very deep, and it does feel like your world when you're there. It feels like who you are. It feels like everything. Now, after leaving, because like I said, religious trauma to me is both the traumatic experience of being in it and the traumatic adaptations that you have to do because you have to leave yourself. And then it's also afterwards. What about that? So here's some of the symptoms after leaving a religion that you can have. Guilt is an obvious one because you've told your whole life to not leave. You're actually more told it this way that other people who left, they're gonna burn, so you're not to do that. And that is accompanied by the fear that you're wrong and will go to hell. And then there's this risk of social isolation, potentially, because we often avoid church and all the teachings altogether. Then what? Where do you feel like that you're not totally awkward? That's the next one. Feeling awkward in the world and how to behave there. For me, definitely it influenced my options for employment, where there are a lot of social norms that I did not pick up. Symptoms of anger, grief, because you did lose a lot. Network, and most importantly, I'd say everything you relied on, because when I've had sympathy from people from the outside, they would put an emphasis on me losing the church, but I actually felt more, I need someone to understand the pain of losing my faith, everything that I freaking believed in, because that seemed like the biggest thing to me. The people, yes, but because I was such a fundamentalist, because there are different ways of being a believer. You can just like show up to church. It can be your traditional background, and then you can be like all in, fighting. Well, like you'll die for this. And I was surely in the last category, if you're in doubt. Okay, another symptom is you can't make decisions because you are doubting yourself. And again, in religion, the self is evil, it's weak, and you need to be saved because of this. And so you choose from what God wants. And now that you're not choosing from what God wants anymore, then it takes a while to connect to yourself, to put it lightly. Feelings of being empty, experiences that you're still thinking black and white, even though you don't want to. You realize, I'm black and white again. And then a whole lot of confusion around sexuality, for sure. So it's a form of mind control because of this fear of eternal damnation and also internal doubt when being in the religion, will I go to heaven or not? And this is both a direct thought, because there are a lot of philosophical, existential thinking when you're in a religion, or when I was in Christianity anyway, but also underlaying what you endure of restrictions, because you have to do all of these things in religion, and will I, will I go to heaven, or will I mess up at some point and not be forgiven, for example? So your mind is controlled, and you are constantly judging yourself and other people. You are judging if you're right and they're wrong. That's usually how it is. But no, there's also a lot of sin in you, so you also judge that. And how you find the right assessments around that is applying the system, the Christian consensus of what is worldly or godly. Of course, it's derived from the Bible. And I want to recognize, because I come to think of this, that if you are a Christian or in another religion, or you know someone who is, and you might feel, okay, she's overreacting. And I have been thinking that same thing, okay? But I know now that I'm not overreacting. And I want to say to you that if you have gone through some kind of trauma, maybe similar to this, something else, I also want you to take yourself seriously. So the whole question, is it a trauma, is due to an element of gaslighting and manipulation. And I understand that the reason why you can think that, okay, in church that can't be that trauma is because, there's spiritual contact somehow there. Maybe you sing, you feel a community, and often in churches there are also very loving people. I grew up in a community, maybe not so lovingly, but I know that there are in the churches that I've attended later in my life, absolutely, a lot of heartfulness, a lot of love. So that ecstasy and that welcoming, how can you talk about that to be traumatic? Well, I'll argue that the price is really, really high. The price is your life, the price is your own mind and your own right to be who you are. And recovering from it not only means freeing your mind, but grieving what you thought was the truth, what I thought was life. And religious trauma is in the category of developmental trauma for sure. For example, the experience of being gaslighted, being manipulated emotionally into craving forgiveness for your sinful nature, which will arrest your development. And so in developmental trauma and religious trauma, you learn the opposite of self-trust. You internalize what you have been told about who you are, and that's wrong. And it's in the emotions, it's in the body, everything actually is just wrong. And in religion, then that's where you're told that you need Jesus, that Jesus is the answer, that Jesus is the solution. And you can say it very charismatically. I almost feel like breaking into song. and so after religion, listening to your own self, feeling like you belong in your own body, that's much more difficult than overstepping your own boundaries again and again and thinking that you are to keep other people happy and soothed, because there was a big element of that in church. So I can give you an example of what I mean when religion is mixed with, it would definitely be part of a developmental trauma. You can say emotional immaturity, if you will. So, and I am speaking about being raised in a religion specifically, talking about going to a religion from a later place in life. We should talk about that another time. But I'll give you an example from being raised in a religion. So my father, who was always in high arousal when I saw him, and as an adult I would probably see anxiousness, but as a child I saw pure fury, his rage and his judgment through his lightning eyes. I was afraid of him, and I also felt sorry for him in a way, because to the extent that I knew from a young age that I could not rely on him. he was too unstable. He was not a happy man. I could not approach him. And I don't know his birth time, but I know the day and year. So I know that there is a Mars square Pluto, and that's at least one of the things. And whenever I mention astrology, it's never just one thing that this signifies, right? But that's could set a tone for something quite that maybe has happened to him that was very violent, maybe sexually even. So what would happen was these outbursts of anger. When I was young, he would hit me in those rages, but then hitting got illegal in the 90s, in Denmark at least, and it just turned into yelling instead. And then this pattern started that is kind of sick, but I think, it was I think it was very well intended, but of course has hurt me. I have felt hurt by it quite a bit. So he would yell something. I'm a preteen at this point. He would yell something and really be angry, walk close to me, intimidating, maybe throw something, hit something, and then he would slam the door on his way out, and I would just stand there in some kind of frozen state. And then 5 minutes later, he would come back crying on his knees, begging me to forgive him. And what he would say when asking my forgiveness was, God wants you to forgive me. If we don't obey God, we go to hell. You have to forgive me. It's for your own good. And he would get really sharp around this if he could look at me and see maybe I didn't feel like forgiving him. So I had to put on a face, because otherwise he would just sharpen the tone. And to me, it sounded like my father. It sounded like this is the truth, so I accepted it. I did not think anything of it. I mean, afterwards, I've been thinking a lot about it, but at the time, I just was, yes, I need to forgive you because of God, otherwise I'll go to hell, so I'll forgive you. This is what we're supposed to do. I kind of hate you, but I will not share that part. I'll just forgive you. And I mean, now as a mother, I've never asked my kids to forgive all the terrible things that I've done to them in their development, but I've apologized. And that's something very different. I hope you realize that it's very different than if he would have come in and said, I'm so sorry. So sorry that I did this to you. I hope you're okay. I'll give you some space, whatever. Maybe that's too much to ask. But if he just came to apologize and then maybe left again, that's different. This was forcing me to forgive him, and the reasoning of it was religious. And the religion is where I felt completely home in a way because of all of this bullshit in my home, in my family. I retrieved myself into the religion where I completely trusted everything. And that was me, and that was my father, and that is the direction of my life. So when he used what I believed and what they taught me, of course, but it had turned into my own truth, for a forgiveness of him to happen, it's actually quite cruel, but I know that, he's unstable and everything, but it is cruel, and it's not okay. It's not okay. It's actually quite narcissistic, because it's not at all about what the child feels, but it's the parent who needs help to forgive themselves, and that should never be on the child. I just remember standing completely still, would say anything for him just to go and not come back. Please, just go. I just wanted him to get away from me, but I couldn't signal that. I just had to say whatever I thought might end this. And I'm just using myself as an example here, which I'm doing throughout this podcast, not hiding that these are my personal life notes, but it's not about blaming anyone. It's just exemplifying. And I hope me being open like this allows you to own whatever happened to you and start to see how that relates to some connections, some of the patterns that are in the present. And with the right support, we will question the validity of that self-concept that came out of those experiences and connect more to authenticity. And religion is the opposite of your own authenticity. I mentioned earlier taking pride in being in the spiritual, etherical realm. And that really relates to judgments. And we know that our intuitive judgments can be influenced by, for example, well, maybe it's an umbrella term, really, hypnotic suggestions. But I mean, it can also be if you're really familiar with a thing, you have deep sympathy for this person, so whatever behavior this person does, you just judge as fine. So in Christianity, there's no room for that. There's an explicit moral psychology to rely on when followers, when the believers are to make moral judgments. So you don't rely on your intuitive skills like that, because they can be influenced. So it's all very firm. But of course, even these biblical pure standards, they can be used to justify something else or rationalize something a little bit different. So yeah, that's also a big topic. But I wanted to mention 2 more things before we go into a little bit of astrology, and that is righteousness and belonging, because I think those are really important. So righteousness is in the thread of what we're talking about here with judgment. And this is, I'm going to read a quote, it's a little bit long, but it's by Leon Seltzer, who's a PhD in something. It didn't say, just a PhD. So, and the article is called Righteous versus Self-Righteous. So that can also be found online. And here's the quote. Biblically speaking, righteousness is about being in right standing with God, versus self-righteous, recognized as giving final authority for one's decisions not to God, but to oneself. I just feel like pausing. This is so important. This is so important with this definition for my whole thinking, my whole life, and also the after effects of trying to connect to myself, thinking that someone else, someone higher is, has to have the answers. Anyway, I hope you heard this one. I'm going to continue with a quote. So self-righteousness becomes paradoxically a kind of self-trusting sacrilege. The person isn't serving God's will, but profaning God by serving or taking final direction from themselves. And then he's quoting someone here. Consider the words of a sectarian author. The irony of self-righteousness is that it trusts in itself, its feelings, its emotions, its desires, its logic, and its understanding. So it never sees the error in its own ways. In short, as deemed by many theistic writers, self-righteous individuals have a bad attitude. They are intolerant, smug, sanctimonious, and overly confident about their righteousness and moral superiority. They attempt to lord it over others, unjustifiably putting them down as weak, dependent, and indiscriminately placing collective faith over individualized, non-religious experience. And then later he is quoting another one, saying, merely holding the view that the righteous are superior to the non-righteous, whatever that means, strongly hints that you consider yourself in the former category, if so you're self-righteous, or in other words, if you're not truly humble about your righteousness, then you can't really be regarded as righteous at all. Yeah, I have no notes about what to say about this, but just that we're going to return a little bit to the issue when we talk about the astrological Jupiter. And why do we even want to talk about that? Well, because astrologically we can be given some keys to what to do about this when we find that in ourselves. So what these quotes say to me is, being self-righteous is obviously a strategy, and it's because you've become prideful about something that's actually underneath a very deep wound and you don't believe in yourself. So yeah, I know that self-righteous feeling coming up many times during my religious life, and then in the attempt of balancing it, becoming righteous in the eyes of the Lord rather. But then that's also a little bit complicated, because if like the last Freud said here, if you're not truly humble about your righteousness, then you're not regarded as righteous at all. It's kind of complicated trying to look good in the eyes of God. And I mean, a big component of the Christianity is that you don't have to do that, because you just have to believe in Jesus, and then that's enough. But then once you're in it, it's like you can't just have a faith without good deeds, and then it's the whole thing. So it's not, I mean, theoretically someone could argue that you just have to believe and then you're saved, but you're still this sinner, and that has consequences. Okay, so I wanted to just touch on belonging too, as this it is a big theme around community. I mentioned earlier that people sympathized when I left the religion more with the fact that I had lost a network of people, and that is a big thing. I just thought losing my faith was bigger at the time, but absolutely the risk of social isolation is real. It's just not feeling like you belong anywhere, because things are a little bit different inside of you than in a lot of people out there in the world. So we know that belonging is a fundamental human need, psychological need. And so again, it's a big topic, but just like, I think if I'm brave enough at some point, maybe together with someone else, I'll do a whole chapter on this specific church that I attended for the last 2 years. So remember, I was in the religion, I was a few years out, and then I was back in. And when I was back in, I was converted by another more traditional church, actually. But then when I had to choose church where I thought that I could stay in, that was sustainable for me, I chose a very free church, a Pentecostal church. And they were filled with the psychology of belonging, actually. They said it directly, that you belong here. And I don't know if it was deceiving or if it was really smart, but I know that it was not authentic. Because then, if it was authentic, then they would have cared about who I actually was, rather than putting Jesus in the center. But that's a bit too much expecting from a church, because that's what churches do. So, but it wasn't authentic love for the individual person. That's the problem. I mean, even this church, that no one called when I stopped. Like no one tried to get me back into the church. It's actually, I think that's a breach in the protocol, because you're supposed to do that. Maybe not in this church. I don't know. There's so many people attending this church. It's called Hillsong, so it's worldwide, and there's just so many people. So you're quickly to be replaced, even though you did a lot of volunteer work when you were there. Afterwards, it's just gone. And in a way, of course, there's some sadness, and I might be able to hear that now that I speak about it, about a grieving that no one did reach out. But I'm really honestly happy that no one did, because if they had done that, then I might still be in it. Can you imagine? I'm so happy to not be in it. So, but I'm just making this point because, yeah, they said you belong here. Yeah, they were filled with psychology, but it was not authentic. It's a manipulation of what they knew about human psychology. And I mean, but that was just for the last church, so the last 2 years of my religious career. Before that, I mean, I was in another free church a few years when I was young too. But the most of my time as a Christian, it's been more dampened. It's more traditional. It's more conservative. And yeah, you can hear it in the way that I'm talking. So absolutely no idea about psychology. Only the psychology, of course, in speaking, meaning the way that you tonify, the way that you say your words, and then you really, oh, now I'm listening. This is about hell again. That kind of psychology, maybe. Okay, but I mean, leaving church, you lose your sense of belonging. It used to be your world, and to this day, honestly, I miss the spiritual and communal experience of going to church because I loved it. And that's why the first time that I did lose my faith, I tried to keep going for a while. And that's why with the years, how many years have I been religious? It's actually hard to count. It's a little bit blurry because of that, because I really wanted to keep going for the ceremonies, the relational part. After I had lost my faith, I really tried, immediately after, and then maybe a year after, I gave it different rounds of attempts, and I just could not do it. Every time I would get triggered, I would get so upset about the songs, the lyrics, the empty greetings from the other people, and the sermon that was the worst. So all the meaning that I had found there, it was lost. So some people did give me that advice when I say that I miss church. They say, also not Christians will say, but why don't you just go and then maybe not engage so much? And that's a real problem to someone who's been a fundamentalist. I'll tell you, it's not, because that fundamentalist is somehow still in me, and it's in another position now. So it's like wartime. I cannot do it. I get so frustrated and angry with the fact of what they're preaching, because I think it's devastating to children, and I think it's really hurtful to adults as well. Okay, but my point and my reason for wanting to talk about belonging is not only after, but actually about belonging in the Christian norms. I mean, that can be kind of hellish, the group rules inside the community, where, of course, one part of it is conformity. So one part is conformity, and I was definitely conforming to a lot of all of the group values and assumptions and prejudices. I was part of it. But the identity of being in that church where I grew up, that was harder because I was so low in the hierarchy. Remember, I came from a home with a lot of unresolved trauma. And I think, other kids could just sense my insecurities, feeling like the problem child. So all of that did not enhance my sociability and my ability to talk with popular Christian kids who had nice clothes and knew just what to say. So, it was my spiritual home, really. This was my spiritual home. I have to say this again, that I love church. I love Christianity, the Bible, all of it. In that home, there was so much social rejection for me as a child. And my own inner emphasis on being an unworthy sinner was confirmed again and again by that community when I was a child and as a teen. And I have this memory of, you go there maybe once, twice, 3 times a week. That depends. But when you see the same group of people, but at least once a week, we would see each other in that setting, and then we also went to school together in another city. And I would just remember that I was so hurt by the fact that they did not say hi to me, and I attempted to say hi, whatever name it was. Hi, Christian. A lot of people named Christian, of course. That's a favorite name. Hi, Christian. And they would look right past me, not look at me, because being associated with me was embarrassing. And so there was all of these things going on. I was so rejected inside my own spiritual home. Sometimes you get the idea that, if I only just believed in this again, then everything would be great, because then I would be in that community. But there are so many things that's as a struggle in that community as well. And I think that splashes out into adulthood, where you'll have 30-year-old people who are not married, or even worse, someone like me. When I came back into church for those 2 years, I was divorced, right? I was divorced, and I had children with someone I was divorced from. It's really difficult to blend in at that point, because there was just not very many people in your situation. I would be put together with that one other person who was single and in her 30s. I mean, it was just not normal, because the normal what I had started to do, becoming married really early, having children, going down that route, except I could not do that. And I mean, I'm happy I couldn't do it. It was my authenticity that broke through. But yeah, I just want to make this point about belonging, that it's definitely not ideal either inside the community. There's so many things going on with their social norms. What do I mean about that? What is a social norm, for example? Okay, a social norm is about preaching. Now, this is directly from the Bible. Like, you have to spread the word of God. So when I grew to be better functioning in communities, being better at the social things, my way of being helpful to other people was to make them, I mean non-believers, make them see their sin so that they could see their need for Jesus. Because I thought that that is what had helped me. All of that social rejection had just buried me with shame and, you know, I'm so sinful. So my way of helping, I hope you understand this logic, was we need help with all of this sin, you know, so we need Jesus. And so bottom line is that as a young adult, I was preaching, more or less successful, trying to be persuasive, promoting how people should live their lives. And an important thing here when we talk about religious trauma, at least in my case, it is about forgiving yourself for hurting people through the faith, because I know I have hurt people through this, and I have been in a lot of healing and therapy, crying about how I have pressured and pushed and even manipulated other people to going to church and to Bible group, because at the time I was such a zealot. I really thought that you would go to hell otherwise. So I was trying to save you, okay? But I have messed up so much because of that clear calling to spread the word. I thought it was my life purpose, honestly. So I've used all of my energy and really destroyed what could have been friendships. Even I remember in my first, I think, a mother network when I had a young baby. Oh man, I've wrecked it again and again with this, because of course people instinctually say, I'm not gonna be preached to, this doesn't feel good. But I didn't see it that way. And I know that another question we often get is, why is it important for someone who is a believer what other people believe? Can't you just be your private thing? Don't make it into a public thing. Just keep it to yourself in a way. But the thing is that otherwise other people will go to hell, and your whole existence is only made tolerable to God because of Jesus, and he's died for you, and you owe it to him, basically. So you owe it to him to tell other people about this. So it's partly duty and partly gratitude. Feel these ecstasy feelings of having been saved. Yeah. Okay, I think it needs to be over soon. I can't talk about it anymore. Just, okay, to sum it up, it's going to be a big sum up. Let's see if we can do it, and then we'll speak a little bit to Jupiter. Okay, to sum it up, religious trauma is about betraying yourself, because you think that you are broken, and when you are born into religion, it gets ingrained in you from a controlling church environment that teaches you to make a decision based on the Bible. And the Bible will not hesitate to tell you that the body is the enemy. So it's in the thinking. It's in that thinking that God is everywhere, he knows everything, and there's nowhere to hide. And there is no other reality, no other goal in life than to tell and share this message. Nothing else matters. since we're living in the end of time as well. It can judgment day, we don't know. So you interpret everything through this lens, and your perspective will validate itself like that. Okay, he's angry with me, I'm such a sinner, I need to try harder and read the Bible more, pray more, and this cycles keeps happening because everything you see is read in that context. That's how it is with a worldview and paradigm, right? So what is taught to us is that you're bad and it's not safe to trust your own self. And your worth, I had never really heard about having a worth at the time. My worth was completely and utterly based on God and having faith in Him. So for me, it meant this abusive cycle of sinning, hating myself for it, and then receiving forgiveness, and then committing in such an adrenaline rush, because now God loves me anyway, and I would dedicate all my time to working even harder, to getting His message out, not at all caring about material things like, for example, money for rent when that time came. So it's a cycle in a mental prison, really, because it's all due to the fact that you consider yourself as bad and broken. That's really the hidden problem here, because on the outside it just seems, we're just preaching love. Yeah. And so in this indoctrination, this logic of being a sinner, needing Jesus, and you'll go to hell if you don't believe. And you have these stories are told to you every day, prayers are every day, several times a day, about how He gave His life for you. How do you feel that someone was in so much pain for you, right? There's this guilt that's going to make you do something. Did you really want Him to die for you? No, that's not okay. So, there's even, especially as a child, you're like, I didn't want you to die. Can we do something else? And you can't. This is the way it is. It's all on you. He gave His life for you. So show up, right? Be a good Christian. And then there's this thing, this is a sum up, but maybe I didn't really say this part. But as a child, I really had a personal relationship to God. Yeah, that's when I talk about attachment, right? He could be that, where God could actually be an attachment figure. But I had no sense of self, no trust in that I deserved anything good on my own. Actually, let me reframe that. You are taught that there's nothing in there. So I say I have no sense of self, but you're actually taught that there is nothing. There's just sin. That shame was installed into me through the so-called loving relationship to God. Okay, so because I remember being a young adult talking to everyone about this, because that's the only thing I spoke about. I remember people reacting by saying, I wish I had such a good relationship to God that you have. I don't believe in a God, but if they would kind of hypothesize that, that's probably a good thing to have a relationship to an imaginary father. But I'm just saying it's not. It's not. It's just not. All of this that you've been led to believe, all of this very complicated to your spiritual imaginary father who is actually too holy to love you. So it's not that possible. It's not that great of a relationship because you have to have Jesus as your middleman there. It has led to a long-term effect on my life and not least relationships. And this is what it does to people. When you think that you are not worthy of anything, then reenactments tend to happen where you unconsciously set up relationships that are doomed to fail because then things stay familiar. For me, it was also in terms of home, jobs, anything that had to do with practically being in this world, because I didn't think that there was anything inside of me that needed or that deserved to be cared about. Okay, so that's the end of the sum up. That's the sum up. So why is all of this important? Again, it's to be able to see the pattern in the present and see where I have shifted between complete collapse and giving up and wanting to die so that I could go to heaven. A chapter on that later. I'm not going to get lost in that, even though I could. So to completely, so either that collapse, giving up, wanting to die, or to completely overachieve and not to get money for it, by the way, because you do it from a pure heart. That's why, and you don't do it for the material gain. So if you are listening, maybe you've been through something similar, and I hope that you too are on this journey of leaving self-attack, self-accusation about what happened, as you realize that conditioning happened, and that was then, and now you have choices. But not only that, because that would also be bypassing, I think, all of the consequences to having been in a religion, which is all about not owning yourself, right? It's about having sold out. So for you to own your authentic, true self, and from that orient yourself through your values, that's an evolving journey with failures that we then will move beyond again and again. And it really requires a lot of rethinking in a grand way. Rethinking everything is how I felt, and it's actually, I made it into a tagline for my Danish podcast. I started the Danish podcast the same year I left for the religion for good. So it was this magazine of interviews that started I don't know if it started the journey, maybe it was a way to have that journey of asking a whole lot of questions. And the title was Rethink Everything. Well, it wasn't the title of the podcast, but I kept saying it in the end, rethink everything. And what rethinking means is that you orient yourself in an authentic way now and then create from there. And that requires great courage, because after I had just left the religion, I was like I said earlier, I couldn't trust myself to have any opinion about anything, and that's actually a really hard way to live. So it means trusting yourself again. It means respecting yourself and finding your own authority and inner wisdom, and respecting your own authority and inner wisdom, which is so far away from religion. So you have to unlearn what you took yourself to be and the world to be. You have to change the entire narrative, actually. And also about loving people, because it seemed in Christianity so compassionate, didn't it? I worked so hard for other people. I preached for them. I prayed for them. I would do a lot of things that other people would ask me to do, because I knew that what I did for people, I would do to God. That is a part of the teaching. So now I have to rewire all of that. What is compassion actually? Because this religious compassion is based on objectification, like I mentioned when I mentioned the core messages. I was talking about that you are an object to be saved. I was an object to be saved, and other people to me was an object to be saved. So the objectification that especially happened when I was preaching, and then the self-hatred, actually, because that both informed the preaching and also the so-called compassion, because it wasn't really compassion, was it? It was coerced self-sacrifice, rather. There's a lot of sacrificing in religion. But do you really want to do this for another person? Do you really want to say yes to help and to volunteer? I mean, I don't really have time. I don't have a job. I don't have a place to live. So in a way, maybe I should use my time on that. But no, Jesus is the most important, and this is the way to do it. And so you say yes, and then you can have this identity of being somewhat righteous, and then there's that whole complicated thing that you can't say that, you can't even think that, because you have to be very humble about it. But there is that sentiment in the background of you that, yeah, there's some satisfaction with myself in the eyes of God when I do all of this work. It's what we're encouraged to do in church over and over again. So a lot of manipulation like that. But it's not really compassion. So the rewiring part is also rewiring what love actually is, when it's not about sacrificing yourself, and it's not about sacrificing yourself in a coerced way. So you have to find spiritual satisfaction somewhere else. I mean, some people also that I know that has left a religion, they just turn their back on everything. And I completely understand. I'm just not wired that way. I needed to find on another place to call whole, and I needed to find something that would give me my life meaning. But I had one more point about compassion. So compassion in recovering is also remembering the people that you feel like blaming, like when the examples with my family, other kids. I mean, it's this thing where, of course, you need to feel the anger, but then that doesn't need to come out as blaming, because I think real compassion is actually remembering that these people are also victims of abuse. And even when I don't know their story, at least I know the Christian tradition. And at least in those subtle restrictions around the body and how you relate to yourself, I do want to call it abuse, actually, with what I know about what a child requires, even though it from the outside seems like a loving family. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about astrology, shall we? So when I had to figure out what archetype to talk about, I did relate it to Jupiter immediately, but it is a choice on my behalf. I think Jupiter is the most fanatic, and again, it's an archetype, so it's the 9th house, it's Jupiter, it's Sagittarius. But even though it's the most fanatic, there's also this great and wonderful key to get out of fanaticism, because Jupiter in its truest form is about spiritual growth, rather than the low version of Jupiter, which would be having found the answer. So, but since this is a newer podcast, and I don't know exactly who's picking this up, I thought maybe to start with just a really short round tour of the zodiac wheel, so I know that you have some idea about what archetypes I'm speaking about. So first of all, what's the zodiac wheel? So the zodiac wheel relates to animals. It's a circle of animals, and we have the sign that almost all have animal names. The circle is the path of the sun, the ecliptic, that are based on the equinox and the solstice. We have the plane of the ecliptic, and then we have the plane of the equator. And between those two, the equator and ecliptic, there are 23.5 degrees. You might think I'm too detail-oriented right now, but I'm just trying to explain what the zodiac wheel is. Okay, but there's this 23 degrees distance or tilt. Those two circles meet at Libra and Aries, and as the Earth spins on its axis, the signs change position and take turn to pass through the eastern horizon. So the zodiac wheel is a fixed thing, and all the zodiac signs are equal in size. That is not like the constellations. So I work with, because they are not equal in size, so I work with what we call the tropical zodiac, and otherwise you might refer to the constellation zodiac. Okay, I hope that was enough. Anyway, it's based on astronomy. I could put it as simple as that. It's based on astronomy, but it's not really the constellations. Okay, so Aries is where you're created, where you're birthed, and Aries, that energy of Mars, is your reason for waking up in the morning. It's your energy. Taurus is where you're gathering resources, and Gemini is where you exchange with others. And so those three signs, that was very short, and it's not fair, right? I'll do it another time in depth. It was really not fair. Okay, but those three signs, we call that the first quadrant. So when I'm talking about the zodiac wheel here, it's in order to portion it up into 4 parts that are really helpful for us when we talk about one particular archetype. So the first quadrant is about finding strength and finding yourself. Now the next quadrant, the second quadrant, is Cancer, Leo, and Virgo. And that is the production quadrant. It's goal-oriented, it's creative, and they are in touch with themselves and they don't compromise. And this archetype is using the resources from the first quadrant to produce. So you're gathering strength, you're finding yourself, you're gathering resources. And then in the second quadrant, you're actually using those things to control and manifest and live out your mission. And in that second quadrant is also where the moon is that we spoke about. So that's really being in touch with who you are. And the sun is there. So it's where you create and give what you're here to give. And then we come to the third quadrant, which is where Jupiter is located, together with Libra and Scorpio. So Sagittarius, Scorpio, Libra in reversed order. So it's about going beyond yourself. So, and if you remember when we spoke about Pluto, I was trying to say anyway, I don't know if I managed to communicate it, but I was trying to talk about how you had to fuse with something else in order to actually become more of you. So it's really the archetype of this is the end of you, and you have to merge with something to get another chance in life. So that's Scorpio, that's Pluto, that's the 8th house. Next archetype. So it's like a development. We go from that and then we go into Sagittarius, which is about reaping the reward of that emotional crisis that we had in Scorpio, which propelled us to fuse with something else. There's a crisis when there is that end of you and you have to merge with something else. And after that emotional crisis in Sagittarius, in Jupiter, we try to reach at least our potential. So Jupiter symbolizes a transpersonal, global perspective where you meet a new frontier. It's about learning and growing away from what you were conditioned to, actually. But at the same time, it's also where we encounter the most dogmatism because of the answer you might find and then attach to. So in Virgo, the ego is strong and in control, and you work to go where you need to go. And in Sagittarius, Jupiter, you need to go beyond yourself, to take risks, push boundaries, to reach the potential. The sign before Scorpio is, like I said, the crisis point where you feel rejected and you try to understand what's not working emotionally, and you have to face insecurities and rejection, and then the transformation comes and you can gain power. And so Jupiter in Sagittarius, when that's the next step of evolution, it's really about developing yourself spiritually rather than only emotionally and personally. Jupiter asks us to transcend personal circumstances, okay? So it's not all people, certainly not all Sagittarius that are doing this, but that is the intention, that's the evolutionary intention of Jupiter, to take us into the potential and into a philosophy that's not yet materialized, and that is a lot to navigate for a person who will always walk this fine line between personal ambitions and then the abstract. When the abstract and the personal then meets, then you have the ecstasy feeling. You have this feeling of, wow, I'm like so alive and it's all good. I mean, as long as you're in that faith. And I do correlate that to really just thinking, even though the intention is actually liberation, we can get caught in that lower form of Jupiter, which is when you have the reward of growth and you are a reference for others, a teacher, someone who shares the answers. That's all great, all good. But it can happen as a teacher that you feel so much ownership over this larger truth that you lose perspective. And it happens because it's really hard to unite the personal with the abstract, with the more global. It's also because the boundaries gets pushed here in Sagittarius. many dictators actually have Jupiter on their nodal axis, because I mean that's an extreme, of course, but and you have to find a balance with everything. It's the balance here about the personal belief and the universal truth, that so that you don't make your personal thing into something that just accounts for everybody, when actually it just belongs to you. And it is a Sagittarius thing to overdo things. That's a mechanism from that's a Jupiter thing. It's a big one. Like we said before, it's really important that you look at your failures as something to learn from, something to overcome, and you learn from it. And that's a Sagittarius way of learning. But then the thing is, sometimes you did go too far with it. So yeah, so I hope you get some sense of how it could relate to having the answer and just feeling that this has to do with everybody. It's a universal principle. But in the same way, Jupiter does have a key for us. It is our potential. It is the result of many failures, actually, having gone too far and then coming back and figuring out where the right boundary is. So through Jupiter in your chart, it's where you share what you believe. It's how you find your spiritual meaning and motivation to keep living. And it relates to a wider perspective. So where you have Jupiter is where you have something to share, and you want people to benefit from that knowledge, and you have this truth that you want to teach to people. And the invitation with these signs and archetypes is always finding the balance. So you have Sagittarius and you have the opposite sign, Gemini. And if you find the balance between those two, so you have a looser grip on your own voice and your own ideas, then Jupiter can really help us question our faith from childhood or our culture, because Jupiter is about immigrating into something new. Jupiter is about traveling, yet the lower version is keeping us in it, being too attached to a belief system if we feel strongly that we do own the truth. So once we're out of that misunderstanding, we don't own the truth, okay? Even though it feels that way. When we're out of that misunderstanding, we're ready to use Jupiter, Sagittarius, the 9th house, to connect to a higher realm and the fact that there is more to life. And it is a holistic archetype, so it is about being part of something larger. And in the chart, it will also show a lot about perception, interpretation of life. So just to mention the 4th quadrant, because there are 4th quadrant in that zodiacal wheel that I started to share about, that is Saturn, Uranus and Neptune are the planets. So Saturn is about realigning yourself into the boundaried maturation of adulthood. And Uranus, we have spoken about Uranus, but not too much, I think. Uranus is about elevating the standards of living. It's about the weaker layers of us, the more vulnerable of us must be helped. Inclusion. Again, you have a high and a low level, because one of the shadow side with Uranus and Aquarius would actually be exclusion or elitism. But the wisdom there is that we all need to be here. We all need the freedom to be here. And then we have the last one, which is Neptune, and we come into wholeness, the word I like. And I hope you start to understand why I like that play of word of saying a place to call whole rather than home, because I've had homes, my family home, my spiritual home, that were actually not safe. And so I just like to exchange the word home with whole. Yeah, okay. I'm not going to keep saying that, because it's just going to be an ego thing. Of like I want you to think that it's so clever that I made this tagline, and really, you couldn't be more bothered. Okay, so Neptune is wholeness, and it takes us into the timeless realm of spirituality. And as you probably know by now, I have spiritual values now, but it's not at all like being in a religion. And if you if you want a comparison at some point, we can do that. But it's very, very different, because it's all about aligning with yourself and not betraying yourself. So that's my main view on that. But there's written a lot about religion, and it's quite interesting how it has served us historically and then gone into not serving us and actually hurting people. And yeah, I'll leave you to it. Thank you so much for being here, and let me know if you have a theme that you think that I should dive into and speak about in monologues like this. And if you don't, then I'll just keep going, because I have many topics that I want to share with you. So thank you so much for being here. I hope you found my email address. If you did not, it is therapeutic@gmail.com. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, and stay close to yourself. Until next time.